Welcome to the Diplowoman podcast, where we will be talking with and about incredible women mediators, facilitators, negotiators, ambassadors, peacemakers, peace builders, and more. I am Ekmekji, and I will be your host in this journey of mainstreaming the women, peace, and security agenda into our lifestyles. With a focus on the Arab region, the Diplowoman podcast comes to you in collaboration with the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, and is made possible by the generous support of UN Women. The Arabic subtitled video edition is available on the Diplowoman podcast YouTube channel. We're thinking out loud with Mina Al-Oraibi in this 7th episode of the Diplowoman podcast. Mina is the editor-in-chief of The National. She's the first woman editor-in-chief of The National. She was also the assistant editor-in-chief, the first female assistant editor-in-chief of Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, where she currently is still a columnist. She also writes for Foreign Policy. Mina is a Yale World Fellow, and she was selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. Mina's here with us today to discuss the situation in Iraq, the recent elections, and where women stand or sit in Iraqi politics. Mina Al-Oraibi, welcome to the Diplowoman podcast, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Karma. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's great to be hosted on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. So tell us, how do you view the recent elections? Where are we in Iraq after 18 years of turmoil, of instability? How do you see the future of this country, which is, by the way, where you are originally from?
That's right. I am originally from there, and Iraqis will always hold out hope for Iraq in the same way that the Lebanese hold out hope for Lebanon, even when things seem very, very dire. And so when you look at Iraq today, you can look at the cup half full or the cup half empty. In a way, the fact that this is the 5th election cycle where there is a transition of power expected to happen, and with so far minimal violence, there's always the specter of violence, the ghost of violence, but so far isn't there. That's an important transition over the last 18 years. However, the political system has failed to deliver for the Iraqi people. And so it is much more glass half full, because actually the political system and the elections start to become a fig leaf for the failure and the dysfunction that is at the heart of how Iraq is being governed. So one of the first takeaways from these elections is that voter turnout is really only about 36% of eligible voters.
That's quite low. That's quite low for these elections.
Absolutely, considering that in the first cycle of elections, where people had a lot more optimism and believed in the possibility of change through the ballot box, you had about almost 70% of voters, eligible voters, voting. So when you look at it being halved in a space of about 15 years, because of course the elections weren't immediate, it took some years after the invasion for it to start, there is a sharp contrast there. And so this is the lowest voter turnout you've had. And the low voter turnout wasn't a matter of people not being bothered, but rather it was a protest vote. It was a way for the ordinary Iraqi to say, I will not give my vote because I will not rubber stamp a process that ultimately is leading to different political parties carving up the riches of Iraq amongst themselves. The biggest problem, of course, we face is corruption. And while during the election campaign, you had a lot of mainly male voices saying, we will fight corruption, there's no real clear party program of how they would do that. And actually, most of the people who are claiming they would fight corruption are themselves embroiled in many corruption cases. And so at the moment, of course, post-elections, we see some important trends. The final results will take some time. The government formation will take some time, but there are certainties that have already appeared. One certainty is that for the first time, you actually have independents that were able to secure seats in parliament. Imtidad, which is the movement that came out of the October 2019 protest movement. Again, the echoes of what happened in Lebanon in terms of the protest movements in both countries, wanting, first of all, a country that functions, The slogan in Iraq's protest was "Nurid Watan," we want a homeland, we want a home that actually works. But also a pushback against Iran. You had many voices calling for Iran to stop being involved in Iraq's internal affairs and to fight corruption. And so Imtidad, which has a number of prominent voices from the protest movement, was actually able to secure about 10 seats. Again, the results are not exactly final. And that's important. We haven't had that before.
So this is unprecedented. And amongst these independents, do we see female faces? Do we see women? And whether in the nominations or in the candidacies or in the kind of rounding up and working on the elections and campaigning, do we see more women faces? Because in the protests in 2019, we saw these women. There were visible women who were at the forefront of these protests. Did we see them working on the elections in Iraq?
So there were more female candidates than there have ever been in the Iraqi elections. And so far, about 97 seats in parliament will go to women out of the 329 seats in parliament. So you're talking about 29 to 30% of the seats. Now it's interesting because Iraq has a quota system.
Exactly. I was gonna say we have a quota system in Iraq, and that has actually helped. This temporary special measure has allowed, for women to enter the political arena.
Right. So the positive thing is you've actually got about 4 to 5% more than that. So you're looking at 29 to 30%, which is positive. However, amongst the independents, there were less women, in part because of the security situation. You had a number of activists killed, female voices being silenced due to security concerns. So actually, there are less amongst the independents. There are others that are vocal within, particularly Islamist Shia parties that feel that they have the protection of the party machine and went out and were much more vocal. But you did have some new Iraqi young female candidates in a number of cities. Particularly, it was very interesting to see in Mosul, which is only just recovering from the terrible devastation after ISIS. Very young, fresh faces, female faces that went out that campaign. A lot of them, unfortunately, didn't make it, but the fact that they were there and they did get some votes,
exactly,
thousands of votes each of them, but they weren't enough to meet the threshold. So that was also a positive change that came through this electoral cycle. Hopefully, next time we'll have more of those independent voices actually make it to parliament.
So in your view, Mina, what are the major barriers? I mean, we spoke about, how there's corruption in the country and there has been, turmoil for many years. But what do you feel are the major barriers specifically that pose an obstacle to women to be more active in politics, to enter the political sphere in Iraq?
The number one barrier is security. Assassinations continue to happen in Iraq. Kidnappings continue to happen in Iraq. Intimidation continues. So the number one obstacle is security, partly for the women themselves and partly their families will discourage them. In an attempt to protect them, they will say, please don't get involved in politics unless, again, there's a big machine that can try to protect them behind the scenes. So I would say security is the absolute number one impediment. After that comes societal pressures. Now, let's not forget, Iraq was the first Arab country to have a female judge, Zakiya Ismail Haqqi. We were the first to have a minister, Naziha Dulami. This is, again, we're talking about in the 1950s, right? So Absolutely. It's not that women haven't been active in the public sphere. The problem now is that culturally, you have a lot of, unfortunately, religious forces that have come to the fore and that have tried to push women out of their natural place in the public sphere in Iraq. And so that's become another obstacle.
Right.
I would say a third obstacle is raising funds. And one of the problems we have in Iraq for both men and women is that there is actually no clear, legitimate ways to raise funds to be involved in political parties. So often they're beholden to, again, these big political parties that they may not adhere to and so forth. So you get a lot of politicized voices coming in rather than women who would come up the ranks. And there are many others, but I'd say these are the three primary barriers, with really security being the number one.
It's interesting you say that, because in the Arab world, when we have these discussions about barriers in the face of women political participation, the societal norms or the patriarchy is usually the first barrier that is mentioned. But your answer really shows how advanced, in fact, Iraq is when it comes to women's rights, or, the fact that women feel that they can actually contribute, and that really those are not the primary barriers that are standing in their way. You have a quota system. I know countries in the region that are still struggling to introduce a quota system. I know, for instance, in Lebanon, the debate is currently going on, and most political parties in Lebanon are almost, avoiding the discussion even about a quota. And here we are in Iraq, we have not only a quota system, but the numbers that have been, the number of women who have gained access to parliament this time are actually beyond what the quota allows for. So this is really fascinating for me to hear. And I think many of our listeners will be sort of surprised to hear that, because also when you say security is, the primary barrier, in a sense, it also shows the situation for everyone in Iraq. It's not only for the women that there's a security issue. This is a problem everyone is facing. But speaking of peace, and speaking of instability and security, how much do you see women being involved in this aspect of Iraq society? Are women involved in peace and security? Do you see that there is that thirst for women to participate in the dialogue processes that are happening, the national dialogue processes that are happening in the country? I mean, this episode comes at the 21st anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda that we celebrate every year. How do you see this peace and security agenda tying in with the Iraqi situation today and the role of women?
So unfortunately, not enough women, hardly any women actually, are involved in negotiations and peacemaking in Iraq. Mm-hmm. They've really been sidelined. They haven't been given a voice. Right. But they're not the only ones. Again, independents, young people don't get a chance to take part. It's usually led either by strong political parties or tribal elders that often keep women very much to the side. So unfortunately, Iraqis haven't had the opportunity to have fresh voices, strong societal voices being involved in the peacemaking. But I just want to go back on the security element. You're right, security is an issue for both men and women, but it's, I think, much more pronounced for women. One is because they can be easily targeted, not only targeted in terms of bodily harm, but also targeted with character assassination. They start to be, tainted in a certain way, and where actually patriarchy is very much alive. I mean, sadly, all over the world. And we've seen this happen to female politicians all over the world. And Iraq, very much so, one picture can be the end of a woman's political career, so to speak. So that is still very much there. And that becomes almost an excuse to then target her actual physical security. So I do think it stands out more. But to your point about peacemaking, I think Iraq would have a much greater chance if women were given a role, but they're not. They haven't been involved in any efforts for conflict resolution. Even on the low level, unfortunately, it's almost predominantly held by men.
That's unfortunate. And we hope in the coming years, we see a shift in that scene, I hope. And Mina, I want to touch a little bit upon something that we've discussed this before, which is public discourse, and how this ties in the politics of Iraq, and the Arab world in general, and the role of women in media, and how, especially we're speaking with you. I mean, you're the expert on this matter. And I'm curious if you can share with us a little bit your views on this, and how we can sort of work together as different, in a multi-stakeholder approach to be able to correct or rectify this distortion in public discourse.
You're right that there is a distortion, and there's a distortion on a multitude of levels, regionally and globally. Everything from, what has a 24-hour news cycle, internet, social media, user-generated content led to in terms of public discourse. That's one element. And of course, Iraq, like all other countries, are impacted by it. But importantly, Iraq after 2003, one of the first things that happened is you had a proliferation of different media outlets. Newspapers, there were within 6 months over 240 newspapers. Some newspapers were only 8 pages, and some were no bumper pack. And of course, TV stations. and radio stations. But then what happened very quickly is that political parties, again, because they were able to get into the system and actually have the money through corrupt means, usually, to run TV stations, they became very politicized. So even though we have a multitude of media outlets, they're all actually, in large part, working towards a political agenda. And that's really hurt the public discourse in Iraq. The other issue that's happened is in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime is, yes, people can go out and speak. You can speak on TV. It's almost gone to the other extreme.
There's more freedom of expression and more outlets to speak.
Right. There's more freedom of expression, but there's less responsibility. Okay, so for what you actually say. But what's problematic and what's happened in Iraq is that you can go out and say, here are documents, I can prove that X, Y, and Z took money from this company, and there's no law enforcement. So actually, it's made it more problematic because people are even more aware, and you're going out and declaring these things, but then there's no one to hold them accountable. And if we talk about public discourse and how it affects women also, we haven't really been able to raise the bar on how we discuss women's issues, women's rights in Iraq and so forth, partly because everyone's thinking about the most immediate, which is, again, security, electricity, food, right? And so we haven't been able to raise the level of public discourse to say, what do we want for the country? What do we want for young girls and women going forward and so forth? We're nowhere near there, unfortunately, and there really isn't the space. And so you ask the question of what is the responsibility or what more can we do? It's to create that space, right? To make these stories matter. There's a small little collective in Basra of women that started their own little media outlet called Lotus, and it talks about women's issues and so forth, but it's very insular. It hasn't been able to break beyond the immediate circle of people who work on it and their supporters. But there are all these small pockets that always give you hope and say, okay, well, let's support them. Let's give them a platform. Let's elevate their voices, rather than get caught up in the political firestorms that are consistent and that make headlines, but actually don't take the country much further or raise the level of public discourse.
I mean, I know you're doing your part in this and allowing for space or creating space and creating platforms for women's voices to be heard. My question to you is, what can we all do in terms of whether academics or policymakers, together with our friends at the media, our multilateral institutions that have a lot of interest in this, what are some of the ideas that we can explore together to achieve, more sort of to give more space to women for their voices to be heard? And my second question that I want also to, if you can just give me your 2 cents on, you pointed the issue of funding, and this keeps on coming up every time we talk about, how we can empower more women, how we can, well, in politics, I'm specifically focusing on politics and peace and security. The issue of funding keeps coming up. So it's either, political parties don't prioritize women, so therefore very little funds trickle down to the women in those parties or generally in politics, or it's short-term and medium-term investments that trickle out with time, and there are other priorities that come up. So what are some of the things that we can do to increase funding for women in politics and peace and security?
Really big questions there, Karma. I'm going to try. The first one about, elevating those voices and giving more women space. I think there's 3 approaches. So one is for young women who don't have enough experience, to give them that experience. So be it internships, be it jobs, be it giving them a platform to write and giving them the confidence, because we see quite often women will think that they don't have experience, so why would their opinion matter? They don't have enough of an authority. So let them build up how they can have an authority and why they are authoritative on whatever they may speak. So that's really important. And tied in with that is mentorship. There are different mentoring groups, and it makes such a difference to just hear someone out and say, and that's what I see is very important for my role. For example, I have colleagues, both male and female, I always try to mentor, especially the younger ones, but I particularly understand for some of the young women and say, listen, when I was, your age, or when I was first starting out with my career, there were certain insecurities that I may have, and it doesn't mean they have exactly the same, but I'd say this is how I try to approach them. So I think talking about it also is saying, yes, there are certain things that are different for women than men, particularly in our part of the world, right? So there are everything from occasions that happen that are late into the night, that a lot of young girls, when they first graduate from university, even their families won't be so keen on them to be out and about and attending these late night dinners and so forth. And how do you prepare yourself, and how do you, act in a workspace environment where actually the men or the women may not appreciate, having a younger, more beautiful woman around, and helping them navigate that. These are very real problems, and that a woman could step back, a young woman or girl may step back from. So that's one thing. The second, so the mentoring and the kind of speaking about experience. And the second thing is that giving of the platform, giving jobs, creating internships and so forth. The third element that I think is really important is saying, well, why does it actually matter to have these female voices? Because it's not charity. It's not we're doing it because we think, that'll make us look good. It's to actually say it's a very valid role that women play, regardless of age, at different stages, and the impact they have on society and the wider society and so forth. And so giving them their right, rather than making it seem like, oh, we're going to do this because it looks good, that we're, CSR almost. It's not, right?
Yeah, it's not tokenism. It's really inclusive decision making. It's inclusiveness at the core.
Absolutely. In terms of the funding is a very difficult one, because it depends who you, and this is across the board. This is for men, women, media outlets, whatever it is, where your funding is and how it comes through is very difficult. And unfortunately, we're at a time in the region, it has been true for some time, that if you get external funding, the European Union is known, the Canadians are known, otherwise, if you're getting external foreign government funding, it really becomes, in some parts of the Arab world, a target on your back.
Absolutely. You're labeled.
Right. You're labeled. Exactly. So, but it is about educating young women, but also men, but particularly young women, about the opportunities that are there for foundations, that it doesn't have to be government funding so much. There are foundations, there are institutions that create funds that they can benefit from. But it's not only about direct funding. It's also scholarship opportunities. Sometimes I think if I step back and do nothing but reach out to young Arabs, and particularly women, and say, listen, there is this opportunity at these universities that are looking for people, and this is how you apply, and teaching them the skills, how to apply for funding and how to be part of that. That's important. But ultimately, we have to start in our own countries creating those funding opportunities. We can't keep looking abroad and saying, okay, they'll come and fund, because of all the reasons that we've discussed. Right?
Absolutely.
Target, it's not necessarily always aligned with what the country needs and so forth. And so it is up to our big corporations in the region. There's vast amount of wealth in the region. We shouldn't be looking outside of it, right?
I agree.
So it's
what about let me ask you this. Diaspora have a role to play. You have a huge diaspora, just like, Lebanese have a huge diaspora, the Syrians have it. Every country that has been faced with conflict and turmoil, has produced a huge diaspora that has been successful oftentimes. So how do you see the role of the Iraqi diaspora playing not only into the political scene in your country, but also in empowering the women of Iraq?
It's a really good question. I think the Iraqi diaspora, like all diasporas, have a very complicated relationship with their home country. And so,
is it love and hate? There's a love and hate relationship there, isn't there?
There's a love and hate, and there is a survivor's guilt.
Right.
So many Iraqis have survivor's guilt, and there's a sense that if they're abroad, can they legitimately have a role to play within their own country? They've left, they haven't gone through the same suffering. Do they have the right? I am one of those people that for years wouldn't be like, yeah, okay, I am Iraqi, but I left Iraq when I was 6 and I don't go back that often. And I was almost like making excuses for how my life turned out, right? And it took me years to realize that actually, no, but Iraq has been such a big part of my life. It is who I am. And actually, because of the politics in my own country, I was in exile with my family. We were refugees and we went through our own hardships. And it isn't competition who's gone through more hardship, right? And so I think for the diaspora, quite often it is that complicated relationship. There's survivor's guilt, but there's also this sense that a lot of people that fled Iraq because of politics. So they want to stay away from politics. And so they've avoided it. They will encourage their children to stay far away from it also. But then they don't think, but they're very charitable. So there's charity, but there isn't strategic giving. right? So
Right.
there's charity. I mean, it's incredible what the Iraqi diaspora and some of the people I know, and a lot of people, by the way, prefer to do it on the quiet, right? So they don't want to advertise it. They're, you don't have these big fancy events and so forth, but they're really, from family to family, they've really supported different communities inside Iraq, and that's amazing. There isn't the strategic giving. There isn't the setting up of a foundation saying we will give in this way. There are a few families that do, very, very, very few. And a lot of them actually were influenced by being in the United States, because in the US, there is that very much more charitable type of giving that is strategic, that's declared and so forth. But it's tiny compared to how much influence, knowledge, and wealth that Iraqis abroad have. But like I said, it's a very complicated relationship. And unfortunately, not enough people think strategically in that way. And they're scared that their intentions are questioned.
Mina, I really want to thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's your personal experience with, living outside of Iraq and being part of the diaspora. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners, because this has become, very common in our region. And so I really appreciate you sharing that about yourself. Mina Al-Oraibi, what advice do you give young Arab men and women who wish to enter politics in the Arab world, given that you know the ins and outs of Arab politics or regional politics very well? So what's your 2 cents?
I would say be careful of politics, but I would say that public service doesn't have to be tied into politics alone, and that there are many ways to serve your country in a public setting, but you could also choose a career path that isn't in politics where you can still serve your country. So I would say think about how you can actually contribute to society, contribute to the betterment of your country. However, for those who have a keen interest in politics and want to get involved in politics, we need better politicians, so we definitely encourage them. What I would say is know your history. Know your history well. Know who the players are, and know that things change. There are no constant friends and allies. There are constant interests. Be aware of what those interests inside your country is, but also that external forces that would play a role in it.
Mina, I am eternally grateful for your time. I know how busy you are. Thank you for being with us today on the Diplowoman podcast.
Thank you, Karma. It was a real treat. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.